Okay, Colin, over to you, and we'll put ourselves on mute while you're giving us your presentation.
Right, thanks very much, Jean. Hello, everybody, and again, we're in sunny southwest Fife, and it's pouring down. In fact, it's dark now, obviously, but it is pouring down with rain. And I had all my stuff outside, and I had to go out and get soap to get it this afternoon. So I've been very heroic. Nice to hear from you all. I'm sorry I can't see you because I'm speaking to the back of a phone, but my wife can see what's going on, and she hasn't laughed yet, so you must be all right. We're going to talk about vegetative propagation tonight, and it's a subject close to my own heart, and we're going to be actually looking at hardwood cuttings, semi-hardwood cuttings, and root cuttings. Without further ado, I'll start off by showing you a bit of sacrificial willow. I'm using willow because willow's very obliging in that it's got pre-formed root initials actually just under the bark, so you could practically root this upside down. And I've actually seen people use willow as fencing, and it becomes very, very live very, very quickly. So I've got a bit of willow because we can sacrifice willow quite easily. The important thing is, before we start though, is that your implements are nice and sharp. And I'll be using a pair of secateurs tonight, and these are Japanese, and they are wickedly sharp, as my finger will let you know. I cut my finger with a pair of these earlier on this summer, and I'm just getting the feeling back now. So nice pair of sharp secateurs, and I may deploy my nice sharp Japanese knife as well. But we'll start off with hardwood cuttings. And the important thing with any cutting is that you know which is the right way up. And with a hardwood cutting, it can be slightly difficult because you're dealing with something that has no leaves on it. But in general, you will see that the buds are pointing upwards. Can you see that? Is that okay? Thank you very much. Can you see that? The buds are pointing upwards, and we always have a straight cut and a sloping cut, and the straight cut is always at the bottom. So when you've got a bundle of cuttings together, all the straight cuts are at the bottom, all the slanting cuts are at the top. So you will be putting it into the ground the right way up, and it doesn't matter what you're dealing with. And we're going to have a look at forsythia and a bit of black currant in a minute as well. But I'll use this willow as my first example. So we're at the bottom of this branch. Okay, that's the top where my finger is, and that is the bottom. So I'm going to take a cut just below the dormant bud, like that. So can you see? Just below that bud there, I'll put my white bit of background behind it. Just below that bud there. And then I'm going to measure up between 9 inches, I'm sorry, I'm not metric, 9 inches and a foot to another dormant bud. So I will take this bud here. Here we go. So keeping my fingers well out of the way, I do a slanting cut at the top. So there is the hardwood cutting prepared. Can you see all of that? Slanting cut at the top, straight cut at the bottom. So we do that again. And I'm just going to do it in real time this time. So I've done 2 there out of that 1 piece of willow. There we go. So what do we do with these cuttings once we've finished? Well, we could, if we wished, put them straight outside in a sheltered bit of the garden, and if you can do it north facing, but it doesn't really matter, but if you can give the plants a bit of shade, that's what they really like. And you would take a trench out to cover more than 3/4 of that cutting. Can you see where my fingers are there? Okay, so you've just got the top the top 2 buds just sticking out of the ground. So you get a spade and you would take a trench out, a narrow trench, probably a couple of inches wide and enough depth to get your cutting right down into the ground to that level. So that'll be probably just a bit more than a spade depth. And what I also like to do is run a bit of sharp sand in the bottom to aid drainage. Now with willows and in fact most hardwood cuttings, you don't need to apply any rooting hormone. We'll be doing that with the semi-hardwood cuttings in a minute or two. So I brought along a pot this evening. You could also put things in a pot if you didn't have a border. And you always have a nice deep pot. Okay, this is what we would call a long tom. You could get quite a few cuttings in here. So literally, because this compost is fairly soft, I'm just going to push it straight in. There we go. And again, into the compost like that. So pretend that's the garden if you want. So as I say, you can do it outside in a bit of shade or under a north-facing wall or something like that. Make sure you've got a bit of drainage in the base of the trench that you take out. The trench only needs to be a couple of inches wide, but the depth of a spade. Okay, but I've used a pot tonight just to illustrate. So those there we go. If you can see that, there we are. And as you can see, it's a nice deep pot I've used. So I'm not going to do any more willow, but what I am going to do is a bit of forsythia. So I'll just move my pot out of the way. And I'm just going to show you the difference in the bud layout between forsythia and willow. So if you can see, in fact, Lucy, could you just come round and hold that white sheet for me? Thank you. So willow is alternate buds, and that means there's a dormant bud there, there's a dormant bud round the side, and another dormant bud to the other side, and it goes round in a circle all the way up. But the forsythia is an opposite bud, and if you look carefully, you can see where my finger is, 2 dormant buds either side of that branch, and then if I turn it round, there's another 2. So they're opposite and opposite each other. So on we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a hardwood cutting of this forsythia, and again I'm going to select where there is a dormant bud, get my secateurs, just trim it off like that, and then trace up the cutting 9 inches to a foot. And if we can see, there's two dormant buds there where my finger is. Yeah, where my finger is there, 2 dormant buds there. So what I shall do is just above it make my slanting cut. Oh, there we go. So that's my first cutting, and now in real time I'm just going to carry on, bang, and so straight at the bottom, slanted at the top. Select to your next dormant pair of buds, cut there, and this is the last bit of material I'll get off here because the plant is starting to get soft. And once you get to the top of the branch and it gets floppy like that, don't bother with it, because at this time of year that wouldn't do anything at all. In fact, all it would do is probably rot off. What you're looking for are hardwood cuttings, the clue's in the name. Okay, and I've just got another bit of forsythia, and as you can see, we've got a floppy bit at top and a nice bit of branch, and I'm just going to run all the way down. Cut at the bottom, slanting cut at the top, and on we go. So out of those 2 branches of forsythia, I've got 2, 4, 6 cuttings all ready to go in. Inserted in. Now, these aren't going into my pot as far as I would like, but this is just to illustrate. There we go. I've probably made one of these too long slightly, maybe, or I've run across a bit of solid compost. This is peat-free stuff I'm using. And sometimes there can be lumps of wood in it. But there we are. So I've inserted all my cuttings. It's as simple as that. It's the easiest way to bulk things up. But not all plants do it. But you can't always use hardwood cuttings for a lot of things. You can use it obviously for willow. You can use it for forsythia, like we've just done. You can also do it for mock orange or Philadelphus. Deutzia, again, that's another early summer flowering shrub. The shrubby cornus you can do it with. And more importantly for you allotment holders, you can do it for black currants, red currants, white currants, gooseberries and raspberries. But with raspberries, you can also use the suckers that are coming out of the ground as well. And in fact, what I'm going to do just to finish off the hardwood segment of this is there's a bit of black currant, and I'm going to try and get 2 cuttings out of this, so they might be slightly smaller. This one is Ben Lomond for those. And if you look at the way the buds are laid out here, they are alternate going up the stem. Okay, so starting right down at the bottom, I'm going for a straight cut at the bottom and a sloping cut at the top. And it always helps just to lay the cuttings out facing the right way up. And I'm going to take a risk with this. It's getting a bit floppy at the top. So I'm just going to do that. And I've got 2. Now, I want to show you something. Like in Blue Peter, this is what I did earlier. In fact, I did it this time last year. That was my hardwood cutting, where my fingers are. Okay. And I lifted that this afternoon. Can you see a nice healthy root system there? You can see all of that, a nice healthy root system all the way up.
Yes, come to that. What do you say? Yeah. I don't know what you're going to do. I'm dead and gone. Yeah.
Right, anyway, let's go on. There we are. So that is what you get in a year. Now that plant is ready for putting in the ground, basically. And here's one that I potted up, exactly the same stage. I would prefer, I did say it's ready to put in the ground, and you could put it in the ground, but what I like to do is actually pot them up, get them established in the pot, and then plant them out in late spring, because you don't want to try and crop off this blackcurrant next year. In fact, what I would end up doing is let it get established, and then I'd be very, very cruel. And I'll do it, I won't do it on this one, but I would actually cut the plant off at a bud, almost not quite at soil level, and allow fresh branches to come up. And black currants and red currants and gooseberries all crop on previous year's wood, so you would lose a complete year, but you would get a better framework of plant. So there we are. So that's the blackcurrant, and that's the end of hardwood cuttings for the time being. Okay, so I shall put these out of the way. Oh, in fact, hang on a second before I go away from hardwood cuttings. This is a blackleaf elder, Sambucus nigra, and again, that was a hardwood cutting this time last year as well. So it's a bit odd looking, but it'll be fine. It'll break away from the base as well when it gets going. Again, I lifted that this afternoon and potted it up. So I'll put these out of the way. And we shall move on to semi-ripe wood cuttings now. Right, now semi-ripe wood cuttings, they're we're a tiny bit late taking these. And in fact, when I worked down in Warwickshire, this was one of the first practicals we did with students when they started in the beginning of September. But we can still get away with it. And what we're looking at here, this is a Weigela Florida variegator. And we're looking at last year's growth. That's that bit there. And all these side shoots are this year's growth, okay? And there is potential for flower on the tips of these, but we'll be stopping that because we want them to actually grow into healthy plants. So most semi-ripe wood cuttings want a little bit of older wood at the base. So just in there where my thumb is, okay? And the way we do it is this. We grab hold and we pull sharply down like that. And we end up, with a nice little tiny bit of old wood. And the reason we want that old wood is because there are growth hormones actually in the older wood of the plant.
No, just the shoot.
Can you see that? Okay. Yeah, just that little bit there where my finger is. Okay. Now I'm going to trim that because we don't want any wispy bits. We just want a nice bit of old wood at the base. So I'm going to deploy the knife. This is where it could get rather nasty. And all I'm going to do is trim off that wispy bit at the bottom. Okay, and then I'm also going to remove some leaves, and also I'm going to damage the stem. Now, as you look at that stem, it's getting quite floppy at the top and it's greenish, and then it starts turning browner as it matures, and then you're into the old wood. What I'm going to do is get my other pair of secateurs, and I'm going to take that floppy bit off at the top like that. And I've left myself a nice long cutting. And also with my knife, I'm going to just damage that bark just a little bit. There we go. That's all I'm doing. Just a tiny bit of damage on one side. And what happens there is that encourages the cutting to callus. And callus is a scab, basically. And under that scab, that's where the roots actually start to form. Now, we will be using a little bit of rooting powder. Now, you can get powder and you can also get rooting gel, either or, it doesn't matter. And all what is in rooting powder and rooting gel are some growth hormones, which will help stimulate the callus growth on the base of that cutting. So, tiny bit. Sometimes if the cutting's really dry, you might have to put it in a little bit of water, but you don't want too much rooting hormone on, because if you put too much on, you can get a huge callus developing and the roots battle to get through it. So just a little bit, and you'll barely see it on the base of that cutting, but there is I promise you, a little bit of a little bit of rooting hormone on there. And I'm using organic rooting powder. Apparently it has natural ingredients and helps rooting and establishment of cuttings, and it's actually worked quite well for me. So we'll go into real time here and we'll have a look at this branch. Just watch what I'm doing here. I'm just pulling down like that. Sometimes you get more. That's a bust. You can't be perfect all the time. There we go. I'll just take those few off.
Jean had a question asking that was that sometimes called a heel cutting.
It can be.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Jean's asked if that is can be called a heel, and yes, it can be called a heel cutting. Yep. And most semi-hardwood cuttings at this time of year will be a heel in general. So I'm just getting my knife and I'm just going to trim that feathery bit off at the bottom like that. There we go. That's that off. And I shall just trim that cutting off as well. And we'll also remove a couple of leaves from each one of these. Some people remove more leaves. I tend to leave many leaves on because you've got to remember the plant needs to photosynthesize, and if you take too many leaves off, you're actually cutting back the plant's ability to actually do that. Okay, so there we go. Now, there's one important thing I haven't mentioned all night is when I was inserting those cuttings, always label them so that you know what you've got. And if you are putting them into a pot and the pots are going to go into the greenhouse, it sounds a bit daft this, but give them a drink as well. Obviously, if you're going into the garden and we haven't had any rain for a while, then you would water your trench as well. But so I'm just going to label my forsythia. That's that done. And I've got Weigela Florida the variegator, which is this one here. And we just need to put a bit of rooting hormone on the base of that, like that. There we go. So now I've got a pot, because these don't go out into the garden at all. These have to have some protection of some description. Apologies for the state of the side of the pot. It's just that the compost was very wet due to the dry weather we've been having today. So I prepared all these cuttings ready. Now, I pushed my hardwood cuttings straight into that pot. With a semi-hardwood, you want a wee dibber of some description. And you want to make a wee hole. And you want to insert your cutting. And you want to make sure you've got compost right down to the base of that cutting. And notice I've got a nice square pot here, and I'm putting more than one cutting in per pot. And what I'll end up doing is probably getting about 4, maybe 5 if I'm feeling generous. There we go. There we go. And even if you're putting them into a greenhouse, it's worth closing the plants down and giving them a wee tent, like so. Now, what I haven't talked about tonight is death. But I'm going to talk about death now, because not all of these will grow. I'm being quite upfront about it. I've killed off hundreds of cuttings. Out of those 4 that I put into that pot, in the situation that I've got, I hope to get 4, and I'll be ecstatic if I do. But I'll be even more ecstatic if I get 3, because 1 or 2 plants will inevitably die, because the fact is you're putting something in that has no roots on it, and the plant needs to make the roots. Now, we're relying on the fact that plants want to grow. That is the important thing to remember. Okay, so plants want to grow, and we're putting something in that has no roots, so we probably will have some deaths. And by the way, there's my label, which I shall put into the pot, so I know what I'm talking about. When they all root, I'm confident that they won't. There we are. Now, don't put these in direct sunlight. If you've not got a greenhouse on a north-facing windowsill or somewhere a bit shady, they want a bit of light, but they don't want direct sunlight. So you could, if you wished, if the only windowsill you've got is south-facing, just put a bit of shade over during the day. That could be a bit of white paper or something, or a bit of newspaper just draped over the top. If you're going in the greenhouse, put them under the greenhouse bench. They'll be quite happy there. They don't need direct heat at all, but if it's going to get really, really frosty, then it is worth lagging the plants up with something. When I was in Warwickshire, we put them all we directly stuck them into a cold frame, and we had a plastic cover over the top, and then we put a plastic top over the top of that. So we're in effect double glazing the plants, because they were all in a cold polythene tunnel. Okay, so that's the semi-ripe cutting of Weigela, and I'll just show you one other that we can do. There are quite a number of shrubs. This is Hebe. Okay, you can see all the dead flowers. They finished flowering about a month or so ago. Quite a nice thing. If you're in a very, very, very frosty place, they may not survive as well. But these are growing just outside the door. So these are Fife natives. Well, they're not native. They are actually from Australia and New Zealand, but they're growing quite happily here in Fife. So I'm just going to deal with a couple of these. And you can see that they're growing out the side there. So we're pulling down again. And we're pulling down again. And you see this top piece, I'm just going to cut back down to where the actual wood hardens up a little bit, just below a bud. And I'm just going to take off all these dead flowers, because you don't want any dead material on your cuttings at all. There we go. And also, I'm going to nip out the top of this, because it's getting quite floppy. Down to there. Do that again here. Trim that little feathery bit off at the base. We've still got that little bit of old wood. Do a wee bit of damage to the side. Can you just see there's a tiny, tiny bit of damage been done there? That's just to allow the callousing to go to form. Trim that off. Scrape gently on the side like that. And I've got a couple of cuttings there. That's not so good. That's too floppy. The only other thing I will do is just nip the top of that out with my thumb and forefinger. And these are quite untidy. Notice that the Weigela were nice and straight. Well, these kiwis can be a little bit wayward. There we go. And you would put a bit of rooting hormone on the bottom and insert them into the pot, just as I did with the Weigela, and you would end up with the same result. And all of these will take all winter. Now, there is some aftercare that needs to be done. You need to keep an eye on these cuttings because leaves will start to die, okay, especially the lower ones. And if you start to see them going brown, you really need to take the tent off and nip those dead leaves out, because if you don't, you might end up with grey mold starting in there, because you've got quite a moist microclimate actually in that polythene bag. If it starts actually running with lots of condensation, you can just lift it up and take it off for an hour or so and then put it back on if it's dried. So they do need a little bit of aftercare, the semi-ripe woods. But they can be taken from about the beginning of September through to about now, and I wouldn't be going any later than the end of October, really. Finish that. So that's semi-ripe wood cuttings. Let's get all this junk out of the way. Shut that up. There we go. Now, I'm going to deal with root cuttings now. This is a little bit different. Now, let's get my seed tray. There we go. Right. Now, root cuttings. I've lifted a couple of these are Primula Denticulata plants. You'll see them in the gardens during the spring with a lovely round ball of pink, deep red, and white flowers. Okay. Now these are self-sown seeds, and they've been in place for about 2 years now, and I've lifted a couple just to show you what the root system looks like. And if you get a plant that has a really nice coloured flower, then if you collect seed off it and sow the seed, you'll get lots of other different colours, and you may not get the colour you want. But if you propagate it vegetatively, like we're going to do in a minute, you will end up with clones of that particular plant. So if you've got a plant you want to save, a Primula Denticulata you want to save, that's got a nice deep red, and I have a variety and it's called Reuben Ball, and I propagate that by root cuttings because seed will give you all sorts of different results. So what I've done here is I've lifted these two plants out of the ground so I can take root cuttings, but I'll start with these, but I'll show you another method in a minute. So a nice healthy root system we've got here. Okay, and it's only healthy roots you want to use. You don't want to use anything that's discoloured. And what I've done here is I've lifted this plant and I've washed it in a bucket of water to get all the soil, snails, slugs, and anything else that was hiding in there. And right in the middle of that growing point is next year's flower, just in this swollen bit here. Okay, and you might think I'm being a bit cruel to it, but it'll be fine. By the time I finish with it, it'll be wishing I left it in the ground actually, but there you go. So a nice healthy right root system there. So pair of secateurs, I'll use my smaller ones, nice and sharp, and I'm going to take some roots off like that. 1, 2. Now, notice when I'm taking these off, I'm laying them out so that I know which is the top and which is the bottom. It is self-evident because the roots do tend to, well, they don't tend, they get hairier the further down you get. So I'm taking a few roots off like this. Okay. That's it for now. Now, what do you do with the plants? Well, I would do that, trim the roots a wee bit, and then I'm going to stick that in a pot, and that will get away in the spring as a potted Primula Denticulata, which you then can plant into the garden if you want, or give it away to a friend, or put it into a plant sale, or swap it for something else. Lovely things and very, very easy to propagate. So there's our root, okay? And what I'm going to do is discard the bottom because it's too thin and wispy, and cut this piece in half. So I'm going to do a slanted cut again so I know which is the top, and another slanted cut like that, and then a trim. So you've got a straight cut at the bottom, a slanted cut at the top, and then got a pot here with some compost, and I'm just going to make a wee hole, dibble that in, slanted cut at the top, straight cut at the bottom, dibble that in. There we go. Take that wispy bit off the bottom. Dibble it in. And I'll do one more. Slanted cut at the top, straight cut at the bottom. And I've got the potential for 4 plants in that pot. Now, I've actually done that, and then I'm just going to finish by filling the pot up, gently putting some compost around the actual plant. If you'd have been really organised, you could have filled the pot right up to the top and then dibbled right through, and you wouldn't be disturbing it. And can you see there's a couple of bits sticking out? So I'm just going to do that. And that trimmed off, firm them in. Label them, and if you know which colour it is, you can actually say Primula Denticulata, and I think this is a white, so I'll write white on the back. And you can, if you're really organised, you can put the date that you took the cuttings as well, and that can then just go on a windowsill, or it can go in a cold greenhouse under the bench. You could actually get away with putting it in a cold frame, or you could perhaps even put it under a north-facing wall, but you want to protect it from getting too wet, okay? If this compost wasn't soaking wet, I would then give it a drink. And actually, with root cuttings, there's a very, very good potential of getting more than 4 plants, because what tends to happen is that you get more than one dormant bud breaking. And if you're like me, you can, if you start seeing the plant start to break with a wee rosette of leaves, you can gently then knock the pot out and then pot the plant up. Don't plant it straight out, it's too small. Just pot the plant up into a smallish pot until it's established in the pot. then you can plant it out, okay? And this plant here, I'm just going to shove it in the smallest pot I can get away with. Firm it in. Let's say this is just general purpose peat free. I think it's New Horizon I'm using at the moment. It's a reasonably priced peat free one. There we go. And that will be quite happy and grow away again in the spring. So that again could go into a cold frame. The other way of dealing with root cuttings, I'll just put all of that potential out of the way and I'll go to my other plant. You could get a seed tray, and this is even easier. Take a root off, a nice root that looks like that. The actual handbooks will say pencil thickness, but I think that's pencil lead thickness, because there isn't any roots on there that are pencil thick. But I have rooted these denticulatas with roots like that, and all you need to do, you don't have to worry which is the top and the bottom, because you're just going to lay it in the compost like that. I'll get that over there like that. Just lay it in the compost. Trim it up a bit. There you go. And what will happen there is, I'm going to cover that over with compost. And what will happen is, because it's on its side, you'll get more than one plant coming. You'll get one at the end, that is the top, so you'll definitely get one from there, but you'll possibly get another one there and another one a bit further down. It's not guaranteed, but it does happen quite a bit. And what you can do then is, once you see the rosettes of leaves appearing above the compost, you can gently tease them out and then cut them off if you wish, and pot each individual section up. So I'm just going to cover those over, just enough to exclude the light, like that. And a label. I'm not going to write it at the moment. Put a label in, and if this compost was really dry, I would give it a water and treat it exactly the same way as I'm going to treat that pot there. Okay, give it some protection, but it doesn't need a heated greenhouse, but it does want to be protected from the worst of the frosts. Remember, these plants are hardy. Okay, we're not dealing with greenhouse plants at all here. Every plant that we're dealing with tonight is a hardy plant. Okay, so there we are. Right.
There's a question there. What other plants can you take hardy? What other hardy plants can you take root cuttings from?
Right. Well, the next one I'm going to do is the phlox. This is the herbaceous phlox, and you could, if you wished, just split this up like so. And in fact, I'll just do it. There we go. Now, you see that? You could stick that straight back in the garden if you wished. But phlox are grown as a nice cut flower. And you also sometimes see them on the show benches in mid to late summer. But the problem with the herbaceous phlox is that it can suffer from stem eelworm. The beauty of taking a root cutting off an infected plant of the phlox, which has stem eelworm, is that the eelworms don't live on the roots at all, and you will get a clean plant. So that's why I would take root cuttings of phlox if I suspected they had eelworm. Now, you will know if your plant's got eelworm damage, because the the leaves of the plant, when it's growing, become distorted. They they should be nice and lanceolate, a bit like the forsythia, like that. But if you start seeing them flattening out and becoming distorted, then it's probably stem eelworm. But these plants actually are disgustingly healthy, and I'd be quite happy to plant that back in the garden like that. But I shall show you again how to take a hardwood cutting, a root cutting. It's exactly the same. Again, you want to pick a nice strong root, and these are not washed, so you can see how filthy things can get. And I'm just going to get my secateurs and take off a root cutting like that. And you can't tell which is the top, which is there, and which is the bottom, which is there, because these aren't as obliging, these roots. And the way I would probably deal with these is by just laying them flat into the seed tray. Okay, there's another root there. And I would just lay that straight down into the seed tray. Pretend that seed tray's got loads of compost in it, even though it hasn't. You just lay them in. You'd have that 3/4 full, and you would lay your cuttings in, and you just work your way up. And again, treat them exactly the same way as we've been treating the Primula Denticulata. Now, somebody was asking, well, what else can you take root cuttings of? Well, you can do root cuttings if you're running an allotment, and if you really want to, you can take root cuttings of horseradish. That comes really well for root cuttings as horseradish. Let's have the convallaria. That is the lily of the valley. That's right, lily of the valley. You can take root cuttings of that. There aren't as many plants that you can take root cuttings of as you can do stem or semi-ripe woods. But basically, your homework for tonight is to find out 10 plants that you can do root cuttings from. And you see, I've turned it back on you. That's probably because I don't know 10 plants that you can take root cuttings from. But there you are. So we have tonight root cuttings of Primula Denticulata and Herbaceous Flocks. We have semi-ripe wood cuttings of Weigela and also Hebe. But most of the hardy shrubs will do from semi-ripe wood cuttings. Things like Escalonia will do. I'm just trying to think, hundreds of things. Euonymus will do. Most of your hardy shrubs you'll get. Things that you can't do, unfortunately, are things like camellias and magnolias, and probably rhododendrons, because they do need bottom heat. You do need to look after those a wee bit better than I would ever look after any of these things here. And again, we have the hardwood cuttings as well, the easiest of the lot. And if you're an allotment holder, the way to bulk up your soft fruit, your black currants, your gooseberries, your red currants, your white currants, and up to a point, your raspberries. And also, I think you could probably do cultivated brambles and loganberries, although I would probably do a tip cutting, but that's for another night. That's for another night. So there we go. I hope that's been of some use to you. And if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Colin. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really good. There's lots of hands clapping.
Oh, thank you very much, everybody.
It was great. It was really good. Really, really good. And you made it so easy and accessible to understand. So thanks for that. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but I'll just put it out to folk at the moment. Has anyone got a question direct before I go to the chat? Anyone want to put their hand up, and you can ask your question directly to Colin?
It's all gone quiet.
Well, while you get your thinking caps on, there are a few in the chat, so I'll just field them to you, Colin. There's a question I think from Enid. How wet should the compost be? I think that was when you were doing your semi-ripe cuttings.
Yeah, well, basically the compost I was using tonight was far too wet because it was in a sack that was sat outside. And the experiment you do is if you grab hold of a wee bit of compost, squeeze it, if water comes out, let it dry out a little bit. What I like to see is if you grab hold of the compost, you squeeze it, no water comes out, but it retains that sort of shape at the end. If it's too dry, I would suggest that you carry on potting, but when you water, put it into a trough and let the pot take the water up from below and then water across the top as well, and they'll meet in the middle. Because peat-based compost, in fact any sort of compost, once it gets very, very dry, it is quite difficult to wet. If you were sowing seeds, you would soak the tray before you put your seeds in instead of watering over the top. So if you've got really dry compost, pot your plant up like we've done with this Primula here and put it into a trough with some water in and leave it for half an hour. And then if the top of the compost isn't looking moist by then water over the top, leaving the plant where it is. And once it all looks nice and wet, just lift it up, and if there's water running out the bottom, you should be all right by then. Should be all right. And probably, if you're actually putting these into a cold frame, you probably won't have to water them again in the winter. Keep an eye on them, but you probably won't have to do anything unless it gets unseasonably warm and there's sun in the middle of December, January, and February. You may have to look back. But we, with our semi-ripe wood cuttings that we did in the polythene tunnel, we soaked them at the start, covered them over, and we hardly ever looked at them until I think we looked at them once a month just to check for dead leaves and things like that. So I hope that helps, and I hope I haven't rambled on too long about that. But the compost I was using tonight actually was far too wet, but beggars can't be choosers.
Thanks, Colin. That's great. Just another quick question, just in terms of like when you're taking cuttings, do you have to work fairly quickly to actually, you know, go through the whole procedure? I know with softwood cuttings, you've got to kind of work quite quickly.
Yeah. It all depends on the material that you're dealing with. If you are doing softwood cuttings in the midsummer, then you really want to take your cutting and get it dealt with within half an hour, no more than an hour. And the minute you've really taken the cuttings, you want to wrap them in something moist, bit of moist newspaper, into a plastic bag with a bit of moist kitchen towel in the bottom. You don't want them losing any moisture that you can possibly help. Hardwood cuttings, they're slightly different. You can take the material and you can leave it a couple of days. But what I did was I took my material at the weekend and stuck it in a bucket of water just to keep them moist, just because basically you don't want to dry stuff out at all if you can possibly help it. And as you can see with the Primula Denticulata, I lifted that this afternoon, washed it in a bucket of water, and then I just left it covered with some moist newspaper just to look after the plant, even though it's dormant at the moment. Rumour has it that the fine hairs on a root will start to die if they're exposed to dry conditions after 20 minutes. So that's a rule of thumb for whether you're planting bare root trees, Primula Denticulata, or anything that has roots. Try and keep the roots as moist as possible. And if you are planting bare root trees and things like that, I always keep them in a bucket of water until I'm ready to plant them, or keep some moist sacking around them or something, because root hairs, that's where all the action is, down here. It's not up here. Root hairs are taking the water in, and if they start to die, you're starting to cut the plant's propensity for living down. So if you are buying bare root trees or shrubs, and they come wrapped up. As soon as you get them home, get the parcel open and get those roots wet. Okay.
That's great, thank you. Any other questions before we finish up for tonight? Anyone else got anything you would like to ask Colin? Colin, I think you're going to be back again to do another propagation masterclass. You've only tipped the tip of the iceberg here in propagation.
Yeah, yeah, and there was no blood spilt either. There we go. Always the results.
No fingers were shorn to bits in the process. I'd like to just thank Colin. Colin, it was absolutely brilliant. Your IT and also Lucy as well. Thank you, Lucy, for camera work, sensational camera work. Thank you. Colin has forwarded on some notes for tonight's masterclass in propagation, which I've emailed to most of you. If you haven't received the notes, please let me know and I'll forward them on to you. But on behalf of everybody, Colin, thank you so much. It was thoroughly enjoyable, really enjoyed it. And no doubt you will be back again. There's something in the comment here. Pamela's just saying, thanks so much, Colin. Fab demo. So there you go. So
no, that's fine. No, more than happy to do it.
Thank you, Colin. And we'll catch up with everybody again soon. You'll be getting emails from me soon in relation to award ceremonies.
Yes.
It's going to be happening on the 27th of November, but we'll keep in touch. But I'll let you go tonight.
Well, I'll see you in Kenaway on Monday.
Monday, that's right. Colin's coming to Kenaway on Monday to watch the ladies harvest beetroot, I believe, Ruth, and Bob, I hope your volunteers are going to be there too on the day. So hopefully it won't be raining, but look forward to Monday. So bye for now, everybody.
Well done, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you very much, Edith.
Thanks, Colin. Very inspiring. We should all be busy.